What's going on, everybody? Alex here, and today we are grading yesterday's trade that sent James Harden to the Brooklyn Nets. If you liked blockbuster trades, yesterday was your kind of day, because not only did Harden go to the Nets, it was a 4-team deal that has tons of implications for all 4 teams. So let's get right to it. So before we get into the grades, here you have the details of the trade. The Rockets get Victor Oladipo, Dante Exum, Rodion Kurucs, 3 first-round picks from the Nets, and a first-round pick from Cleveland via the Bucks. The Nets get James Harden and a second-round pick from Cleveland. The Pacers get Karis LeVert and a second-round pick from the Rockets. And the Cavaliers get Taurean Prince and Jarrett Allen. The Rockets also get 4 first-round pick swaps from the Nets that aren't pictured. So let's start with the newly formed super team in Brooklyn, and I'm going to give them a solid B for this trade. In their first season with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, the Nets haven't exactly impressed, as they have a 6-6 record, and all 6 of their losses are against teams that are currently below 500 and missed the playoffs last year. To make matters worse, Kyrie Irving has taken the last 4 games off due to personal reasons without alerting any of the Nets coaches or executives, and it's unclear when he'll return. The rumor that Harden wanted to be traded to the Nets started before the season, and the only way I believe the Nets wouldn't have wanted to pull the trigger is if they started the season with really good chemistry and didn't want to mess that up by adding Harden. They started off the year with a really deep guard rotation, so the thought that they wouldn't need to add Harden to win a championship was valid at the beginning of the season. But now, with the Nets' lackluster start, Spencer Dinwiddie's season-ending injury, and Kyrie Irving's personal absence, the Nets needed to make a move for Harden to have a real chance of winning the championship. According to 538, the Nets had a 2% chance to win the title before this trade, and now they have a 16% chance. And I agree with them, because before this trade, the Nets didn't really have much of a chance to beat the Lakers or Clippers, who both have 2 superstars who've had more time to gel together than Durant and Irving. But now, with 3 of the top 15 or so players in the league in Durant, Irving, and Harden, the Nets are by far the best team on paper in the NBA. Despite that, the Nets still have a lot of hurdles to clear to win an NBA championship. Issue number 1 is Kyrie Irving, who was obviously going to be an issue with or without James Harden. If Kyrie's absence continues, not only will this be an issue with the media, but his teammates are going to start to get irritated because they're playing their tails off to try to win a championship, and Kyrie just ditched them. Issue number 2 is whether the Brooklyn locker room is going to accept James Harden after the way he quit on Houston. It's certainly fair to think that Harden will get into game shape and start trying harder now that he got to his preferred destination, but we can't assume that right away. And after seeing how ridiculously unprofessional he was in Houston, he's going to have to prove to his new teammates that he's changed his ways. Issue number 3 is their depth, as they've now lost key role players Spencer Dinwiddie, Karis LeVert, and Jarrett Allen since the beginning of the season. Bruce Brown and Landry Shamet are going to have to step up to replace Dinwiddie and LeVert's production, and DeAndre Jordan and Jeff Green are going to have to be able to replace Allen's defensive presence in the middle. While those 3 things are really concerning, by far the biggest concern is whether Harden, Durant, and Irving will be able to gel together in time for the playoffs. I'm not too concerned about Kevin Durant, as he fit in pretty well in Golden State with other ball-dominant stars, but Kyrie Irving and James Harden have always had the ball in their hands throughout their career, so they're going to have a tough time meshing together. If I'm Steve Nash and the Nets coaching staff, I play Irving and Harden separately as much as I can, because they're going to mix like oil and water. And the more games Kyrie Irving misses, the worse this problem gets, because this team needs reps together. As we saw with the Clippers last season, you can't expect to miss a ton of regular season games and expect everything to click in the playoffs. So because of these obstacles for the Nets, I still believe that the Lakers should be the favorites to win the NBA title, but the Nets have certainly gotten themselves closer. The timing of this trade tells me that the Rockets were desperate, because it comes just a day after James Harden told the media that he believed that the Rockets situation couldn't be fixed. So with that considered, it's a little surprising that the Nets still had to give up all of the draft picks that they could, in addition to LeVert, Allen, and Kurucs. But even though they didn't dot their I's and cross their T's in negotiations, so to speak, the Nets still get a solid B because they got the job done that they needed to do. Next up, we'll grade the Houston Rockets, Harden's old team, and I'm going to give them a solid C for this trade. First off, let me just say that if the circumstances didn't exist that James Harden demanded a trade and was being immature about it, this trade would get an F, because what the Rockets got is not even close in value to James Harden. But when I give them a C, I'm considering the fact that they had Harden, who was not playing well, first of all, and also being extremely toxic in the locker room and enraging his teammates with his immature behavior. As I mentioned, this trade comes just a day after Harden said to the press that the Rockets just weren't good enough and couldn't be fixed. When the rest of his team hears that, obviously they wouldn't have responded well, so the Rockets needed to make a move, and fast. The good part of this trade for the Rockets is that, as I believe they needed to do, they got as many picks as they could and pick swaps so they could enter a rebuild. The bad news is that they basically traded the Hope Diamond for a bunch of tiny jewels. None of the players and picks that they got in this trade are very valuable. I'm going to talk more about Victor Oladipo when I give the Pacers a grade, but for now we can state the obvious and say that he's nowhere near a replacement for James Harden. Dante Exum was once the 5th pick in the draft, but at this point in his career he's nothing more than a salary filler. Rodions Kurucs is still very young at 22, but he isn't a top-notch prospect. 2 of the 4 first-round picks Houston got were from Brooklyn next year and from Milwaukee next year, which are going to be very low first-round picks because Brooklyn and Milwaukee are still going to be contenders next year. The other 2 first-rounders Houston's getting are from Brooklyn in 2024 and 2026, which could be valuable if Durant, Irving, and Harden all leave in free agency before then, but if they don't, they're also going to be of minimal value. The pick swaps they're getting are the same way, in that the short-term ones aren't going to be valuable at all, but the long-term ones could be something. There are 2 saving graces for the Rockets in this trade. The first is that they know they're rebuilding, whereas other potential Harden trades had them kind of stuck in the middle. By the time John Wall's contract expires, the Rockets will be getting high lottery picks in addition to the picks that they got from this trade, so they should be able to rebuild effectively despite the fact that they gave up a lot of picks to get Russell Westbrook. The other saving grace for the Rockets is that Victor Oladipo and Dante Exum are both on expiring contracts. They should have significant cap space going forward to take on bad contracts from other teams and get more draft picks for doing that. Nonetheless, the Rockets went quantity over quality in terms of the assets they got in this trade. None of the picks they got are likely to be of high value, and they didn't get an elite young player like Ben Simmons. So even though Harden's antics put them in a really tough spot, I'm still giving the Rockets a C. Next on the list are the Indiana Pacers, and I'm going to give them a B+ for this trade. If you watched my other James Harden trade video, you saw that I predicted that Caris LeVert would go to the Pacers as part of this trade. The Pacers were an elite defensive team last season and were 5th in defensive rating, but only 18th in offensive rating, and they could really use a bucket-getting guard like LeVert. But what was a little surprising is that they also traded a similar style guard in Victor Oladipo to get him. This could have been because Houston preferred Oladipo's expiring contract as opposed to LeVert's 3-year deal so they could have cap space going forward. And Indiana may have thought Oladipo would have been out of their price range in free agency. But since Oladipo is coming off a ruptured quad tendon recently, it makes you wonder if Indiana knew more about this injury than the rest of the league. To be clear, I'm not saying that the Pacers failed to disclose details about Oladipo's injury to the Rockets. But this does remind me of the Isaiah Thomas trade to the Cavs 2 years ago, and that the Cavs traded for Thomas based on his value before his injury, and he wasn't nearly as good once he got there. In 2018, Oladipo emerged as a superstar, averaging over 23 points a game on nearly 48% shooting. But in the 3 years since then, he's played just 64 games because of his injury, and he hasn't been nearly as good. So this is different from Thomas's situation because Oladipo already came back from his injury before he was traded. But the Pacers might know that Oladipo's injury has negatively affected him more than other teams know because they've been around him every day in practice. But either way, I like this trade for the Pacers because LeVert has been excellent this season and Oladipo hasn't been the same guy he was in 2018. And also, LeVert is less expensive than it would have been to re-sign Oladipo. When I predicted that the Pacers would pursue LeVert, I also predicted that they would want to get Spencer Dinwiddie and Jarrett Allen, but now Spencer Dinwiddie is out for the season, and they don't really need Allen because Miles Turner is blocking over 4 shots per game this year. I'm not really sure why Houston also gave Indiana a future second-round pick, but it's just the icing on the cake for the Pacers, as that pick could be pretty high in the second round. That's, for me, what puts the plus on what was already a solid B trade for Indiana. The last team in this trade is the Cavaliers, and I'm going to give them a C- because this trade doesn't make sense for them. In this era where traditional big men that can't shoot are less prevalent than ever, the Cavs have now acquired 3 of them since last year's trade deadline, in Andre Drummond, JaVale McGee, and now Jarrett Allen. You simply can't have 2 of those 3 bigs on the court at the same time because opposing offenses are going to exploit mismatches against them with quicker players. Considering that Drummond is a star, that leaves very little playing time left for Allen and McGee, who are both starting caliber bigs. The Cavs have a good-looking young backcourt in Darius Garland and Colin Sexton, but what they needed is another wing, not another big. They did get Taurean Prince, who can play either forward spot and started 61 games for the Nets last year, but he shot just 37.6%, so he's really just a salary filler in this trade. The only reason I think the Cavs got Prince is because I don't think the Rockets wanted his 2-year deal, so the Cavs gave them Dante Exum's expiring contract instead. I think Jarrett Allen is a really good player, and I don't think giving up a late first rounder, a second rounder, and taking on Prince's contract is too much to give up for him. But since he's barely going to get any minutes as of now, this trade doesn't make sense for the Cavs, so I'm giving them a C-. If they end up moving Drummond or McGee, I would definitely give them a higher grade. So there are my grades for the 4-team mega deal that involved James Harden going to Brooklyn. Let me know what you guys thought of it in the comment section. If you like this video, or even if you didn't, be sure to drop a like. It really helps a young YouTube channel like this one grow. And if you haven't yet already, make sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you don't miss another video. And other than that, peace out, y'all.